She wasn't supposed to fly. The rules were written. The skies were claimed. Every door was locked until she kicked them open. This isn't just a story about pilots. It's a story about rebellion at 10,000 feet. In an age when the clouds were seen as the playground of great men, women were told to keep their feet on the ground. They were too fragile, too delicate, too emotional. But wings are not born from muscle. They are born from courage. And these women had an endless supply. From the roar of Amelia Earhart's fearless horizon to the deadly precision of the Night Witch's midnight raids. From Jeannie Leavitt breaking the sound barrier to Eileen Collins commanding a space shuttle, they took an aviation world that told them no and turned it into altitude. Every flight was a declaration. Every takeoff was history. They didn't just soar for glory, they soared for every girl told she couldn't. The sky didn't give them permission. They took it. And when they did, the world changed forever. This is the story of the women who didn't just touch the sky, they owned it. She wasn't supposed to fly. The rules were written, the skies were claimed, and every door was locked until she kicked them open. From the roaring engines of war to the silence of space, women who were told no turned it into altitude. They flew in darkness, under fire, across oceans and above expectations. Every takeoff was rebellion. Every landing was history. These weren't just pilots. They were pioneers who carved their names into the clouds. From Amelia Earhart's fearless horizon to Jeannie Leavitt's fighter wings, from the Night Witch's midnight raids to Eileen Collins commanding a space shuttle, they proved courage isn't bound by gravity. The sky didn't give them permission. They took it. And when they did, the world changed forever. This is their story. The story of women who didn't just touch the sky. They owned it. The sky was never meant for them. At least, that's what the world once believed. In an age when the clouds were seen as the playground of gods and great men, women were told to keep their feet on the ground, their hands busy with the earth, not the engine. Yet somewhere in the hush before dawn, as propellers hummed and the scent of oil filled the air, a few brave souls looked up and saw not danger, but destiny. They were told they were too fragile, too delicate, too emotional to fly. But wings are not born from muscle. They are born from courage, and courage was something these women had in endless supply. Aviation was still a newborn dream. Fragile, loud, unpredictable. The Wright brothers had barely lifted off when a generation of women watched, fascinated, not by the men in flight, but by the sky itself. The air became a promise, and those who dared to chase it would redefine what was possible. History would remember the first flight, but it would almost forget the women who refused to stand on the sidelines. Their story begins in quiet defiance, a refusal to be earthbound. While newspapers mocked, while governments restricted, while society insisted they were ornaments and not pioneers, these women built their own hangars, begged for second-hand planes, and flew anyway. They learned in secret, in borrowed fields, from patient mentors or stubborn trial and error. Their fuel was not just gasoline, it was hunger, ambition, and an unshakable need to prove that gravity obeyed no gender. Every flight was a rebellion. Every takeoff a declaration. They didn't just soar for glory, they soared for every girl told she couldn't. Their engines roared with a message the world couldn't yet understand. The sky belongs to those who dare. And so, through wind and doubt and danger, they rose, the first women aviators, carving their names into the blue before anyone thought they belonged there. The story of how they took the sky doesn't begin with fame. It begins with a dream, one that refused to stay grounded. The first wings belonged to those who refused to listen. In 1910, in France, a woman named Raymond de la Roche stepped into a fragile fabric-covered plane and became the first woman in history to earn a pilot's license. The world laughed at her, called her reckless, but when she lifted off, the air went silent. For the first time, a woman was above them all, literally. Her flight was short, bumpy, and terrifying, but it changed everything. The sky had been breached, and no one could close it again. Across the ocean, Harriet Quimby watched from America. A journalist by trade, she wrote stories about adventure. But words weren't enough. In 1911, she earned her pilot's license, dressed in her signature purple flight suit, and became a sensation. The following year, She crossed the English Channel, the first woman ever to do so. The fog was thick, her compass unreliable, and the cold bit at her hands, but she made it. When she landed, there were no crowds, no headlines. The Titanic had sunk the day before, stealing her spotlight. Yet her legacy endured, shimmering quietly in the pages of history. These early aviators faced not just the elements, but ridicule. They were told flying was unfeminine, that their bones were too light, their nerves too soft. They were banned from clubs, forbidden from air shows, denied access to the very machines they loved. Many bought old planes with their own money, patched them with fabric, and risked their lives to prove a point. The engines sputtered, the wings wobbled, but their determination never faltered. Elise de Roche, Bessie Coleman, Hilda Hewlett, names that whispered against the roar of progress. Bessie, an African-American woman in the 1920s, was denied flight training in the United States, so she learned French, traveled to Paris, and became the first black woman pilot in the world. She returned home not just to fly, but to inspire. "The air," she said, "is the only place free from prejudice." They flew not for fame, but for freedom. Each takeoff was a protest, each landing a triumph against centuries of limitation. They had no role models, no guarantees, only wind, courage, and a longing to rise. The crowds watched in awe, the critics fumed, and slowly, impossibly, the world began to change. The first wings carried more than pilots. They carried the weight of generations. And though many of those early pioneers would crash, fade, or be forgotten, the sky they opened would never close again. The world went to war, and once again, the sky became a battlefield. Engines screamed across continents, smoke coiled through the air, and men filled the cockpits of bombers and fighters. Yet, behind the roar of war, women were waiting, ready, trained, and uninvited. When nations demanded sacrifice, they stepped forward, not to nurse or to type, but to fly. Their hands could grip a control stick just as firmly as a rifle. Their courage did not ask for permission. In the Soviet Union, they called them the night witches. Young women barely in their 20s, flying wood and canvas biplanes designed for training, not combat. They flew in darkness, cutting their engines before each strike, gliding silently over enemy camps before dropping their bombs. The Germans feared them, whispering that only witches could fly without sound. Their real names were Nadezhda Popova, Yevdokia Bershanskaya, Irina Sabrova. Daughters, students, dreamers turned into phantoms of the night. They flew over 30,000 missions. Some came back covered in frost, others never returned at all. Their reward was not glory, but survival. In America, the war brought both opportunity and insult. The government needed pilots, but refused to let women fight. Still, Jackie Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love refused to accept the ground. They formed the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs. Their mission was to ferry planes across the country, test new aircraft, and train male pilots heading to combat. They flew everything from trainers to bombers, logging millions of miles with no weapons, no armor, and no recognition. The WASPs wore the same uniforms, risked the same dangers, but when one of them died, there was no flag on the coffin, no salute, no government compensation. They paid for their own funerals. Yet they kept flying. They were told they weren't real soldiers, but they proved they were real pilots. Every takeoff was an act of defiance. Every landing a quiet victory against the bureaucracy that refused to see them. Across the Atlantic, women filled the skies of Britain. The Air Transport Auxiliary, the ATA, hired women to deliver warplanes from factories to airfields. They flew Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Lancasters, often without radios, sometimes without maps. Amy Johnson, Britain's beloved aviator, joined them, only to vanish over the Thames estuary in 1941. No one ever found her plane. Her disappearance became a haunting symbol of the women whose bravery history too easily forgot. These women fought two wars, one in the air and one for recognition. They faced disbelief from generals and scorn from journalists. Some called them distractions, others called them heroes, but they didn't fly for either. They flew because it was what they were born to do. The machine didn't care who held the stick. The sky didn't care who took off. The night witches flew with frostbitten hands, their planes riddled with bullet holes. The Wasps trained under the Texas sun, ferrying bombers through turbulent skies. The ATA pilots fought fog and fatigue across England's gray horizon. Each of them carried the same invisible burden to prove that courage was not bound by gender. When the war ended, the men returned home as heroes. The women were quietly dismissed. The Wasps were disbanded, their records sealed, their wings unacknowledged. The Night Witches faded into Soviet silence. The ATA women were thanked, then forgotten. But their legacy did not vanish. In every corner of the world, a young girl looked up at the sky and saw not clouds, but possibility. War had shown that women could fly, fight, and command the air with the same nerve and precision as any man. Yet peace took that truth and buried it beneath medals and parades that bore no female names. It would take decades before the world remembered them. Before their service was honored, their courage recognized, their wings restored. The women of war didn't wait for permission. They built their legacy in the roar of engines and the silence of loss. They flew into history without knowing if history would ever speak their names. But history does now, and it whispers a truth written in exhaust and flame. When the world was burning, women still took to the sky. The war had ended, but the echo of engines still lingered in the sky. For many, peace meant silence. But for the women who had flown through gunfire and doubt, silence was unbearable. The world was rebuilding, reimagining the future, and the sky was no longer a battlefield. It had become a symbol of progress, speed, and limitless ambition. Jets replaced propellers, and humanity's obsession with the horizon became faster, louder, and higher. But once again, as the technology advanced, women were told to step aside. The air belonged to science, they said, to test pilots and men of precision. Yet there were still a few who refused to yield the controls. Jacqueline Cochran had been a legend in wartime, a commander of the Wasps, and a pilot with more records than any man alive. After the war, she aimed higher still. She wasn't content with altitude or distance. She wanted speed, the kind that shattered barriers, that tore through sound itself. In 1953, with Chuck Yeager as her wingman, Jacqueline climbed into the cockpit of an F-86 Sabre. The sky was clear, the air thin, and when she pushed the throttle forward, the world changed. The sonic boom cracked across the desert. She had done it. The first woman to break the sound barrier. Her triumph wasn't just mechanical, it was symbolic. The sky had grown faster, but her determination had outpaced it. Yet, even as she soared into history, the path behind her remained narrow. The jet age was ruthless, built on competition and ego. Male pilots dominated the new frontier of flight testing. They were the faces of progress, immortalized in magazines and parades, while women, even those who had trained them, were forgotten. But a small, determined group refused to vanish quietly. In the early 1960s, a woman named Jerry Cobb walked into NASA with a dream and a resume that outshone many of her male peers. She had set multiple speed and altitude records, flown over 60 types of aircraft, and passed all the same rigorous medical tests designed for the Mercury astronauts. Cobb wasn't alone. 12 other women followed, pilots, engineers, and adventurers, later known as the Mercury 13. They endured isolation chambers, extreme temperatures, exhaustion, and silence. They didn't break. They proved women could endure the same physical and mental strain as the men chosen for spaceflight. But NASA closed the door. Congress said there was no need for female astronauts. Politics grounded what passion had prepared. For these women, the betrayal stung deeper than any crash. They had trained to touch the stars, only to be told they belonged in the audience. Jerry Cobb never flew into orbit, but she never stopped advocating for women in space. Her disappointment became the spark for those who followed. The barrier wasn't the sound anymore. It was access, and breaking it would take a different kind of endurance. While the Mercury 13 were dismissed, Jacqueline Cochran kept pushing limits. She broke altitude records, commanded racing circuits, and wrote about the future of flight. Her competitive spirit defined an era when speed was everything, but her victories were bittersweet. She knew she was the exception, not the rule. The world admired her, but didn't open the hangar doors any wider for the women behind her. In hangars across the United States and Europe, women continued to test, race, and fly, sometimes in secret, often without pay. Florence Pancho Barnes built an airfield for speed freaks and dreamers, a desert outpost where the sound of jet engines never stopped. She raced against the best and laughed in the face of anyone who doubted her. Her spirit mirrored an entire generation of women pilots who refused to fade, even when history refused to write their names. The post-war years were a paradox. The machines became stronger, the skies wider, yet the doors for women pilots grew smaller. Aviation had evolved, but equality lagged behind. Still, the courage of those who flew, Cochrane, Cobb, Barnes, and the unnamed many, laid the runway for something greater. Their fight was no longer just about altitude or speed. It was about proving that ambition had no gender. The sound barrier was not the end of flight. It was a symbol, a reminder that every limit could be shattered with enough willpower and daring. The women who pursued that line of thunder didn't just challenge physics, they challenged history. And though many never reached the stars, they left their fingerprints on the controls of every plane that followed. They had flown through silence, through doubt, through rejection, and still looked upward. The jet age had crowned new heroes, but in the heart of that era's roar was the quiet, relentless pulse of those who refused to be grounded. The world was reaching for space, and the women who once broke the clouds were now looking far beyond them. Their story wasn't over. It was only ascending. The race for the sky had reached its ceiling, and the world turned its eyes upward to the stars. The dawn of the space age burned bright against the Cold War's shadow, a time when nations measured power not by armies, but by how far they could fly from Earth. Rockets replaced planes, and pilots became astronauts. The horizon was no longer the limit, it was the launch pad. And once again, women stood at the edge of history, watching men rise while they were told to wait. But waiting was never their way. In 1963, a textile worker from Russia named Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman to travel into space. She wasn't a soldier nor a scientist, but she was determined, resilient, and fearless. When her Vostok 6 capsule lifted off, the Earth below fell silent. She orbited the planet 48 times, alone, enduring dizziness, nausea, and the crushing pressure of the unknown. Yet when she landed, bruised and exhausted, she smiled. "Hey, Sky," she said, "take off your hat, I'm coming through." Her mission lasted just 3 days, but it shattered centuries of exclusion. A woman had reached the cosmos, and nothing on Earth could deny it. But the triumph of Tereshkova was not easily followed. For nearly 20 years, no other woman would fly into space. The world celebrated her, but institutions still resisted change. In America, the Mercury 13, those who had trained, tested, and proven themselves worthy, were still grounded. NASA claimed there was no room for women astronauts, that the program demanded military pilots, and women were not permitted in combat roles. The barrier was not science, it was politics dressed as procedure. It wasn't until 1983 that the silence broke again. Sally Ride, a young physicist with calm eyes and quiet determination, became the first American woman in space. When she boarded the Challenger, she carried not just instruments and experiments, but the weight of a generation's dreams. Reporters asked if spaceflight would affect her emotions, if she wore makeup, if she cried. Sally answered not with words, but with precision and professionalism that silenced every doubt. "You don't just sit in the shuttle and look out the window," she said later. "You go there to work." She did, and she worked flawlessly. Her success marked a turning point. The image of the astronaut, once masculine and mythic, began to change. Women from across the world followed. Svetlana Savitskaya became the first woman to perform a spacewalk. Mae Jemison, a doctor and engineer, became the first black woman in space aboard Endeavour. Eileen Collins, a test pilot with thousands of flight hours, broke another frontier as the first female shuttle commander. Each mission was more than a scientific milestone. It was a statement of equality written against the canvas of the stars. Behind each launch, there were decades of unseen struggle. Women scientists who built the engines, calculated the trajectories, and guided the spacecrafts never wore flight suits but carried the mission on their backs. Katherine Johnson's equations guided Apollo 11 to the moon, while Margaret Hamilton's software prevented disaster during lunar descent. The world applauded the astronauts but forgot the women behind the numbers. Yet their brilliance was no less heroic. The era of space exploration revealed a truth the world could no longer deny. Courage was universal, curiosity was human, and determination was genderless. The first woman in orbit had come from a small village, the next from a laboratory. Others would come from classrooms, test sites, deserts, and dreams. They all shared the same defiance, the refusal to accept that the stars were not for them. As the shuttle era rose, so did the diversity of its crew. Women commanded missions, led engineering teams, and even repaired satellites in the vacuum of space. When Eileen Collins piloted the Discovery in 1995, she looked out over the blue curve of Earth and said later, "When I looked down and saw the planet, I thought, every person on that surface belongs up here." Her words carried the legacy of every woman who had been told no, every dream dismissed as fantasy. From the fragile biplanes of the early pioneers to the roaring rockets of the modern age, the journey had come full circle. The women who once defied gravity were now defying the void itself. They didn't just take flight, they rewrote the story of exploration. Space, like the sky before it, had once been declared a man's domain. But as the stars reflected off the visors of women astronauts, engineers, and scientists, it became clear that the future of flight, of humanity, would not be measured by who reached it first, but by who refused to stop trying. The astronaut era proved what the pioneers already knew. No frontier is closed to those who dare. The sky had given them wings, space had given them purpose, and somewhere, beyond the thin blue line of Earth's edge, the dream of flight still whispered, calling the next woman to rise. The world had changed. The roar of rockets and the thunder of war had faded, replaced by the steady hum of jetliners crossing oceans. Flight was no longer the privilege of a daring few. It had become the rhythm of modern life. Planes stitched the continents together, carrying families, soldiers, and dreamers from one horizon to another. But behind the glossy posters of smiling pilots and silver wings, one truth remained the same. Most of those cockpits were still closed to women. For decades, commercial aviation was an exclusive club, guarded by tradition and quiet prejudice. Airlines believed passengers wouldn't trust a female captain. Flight schools often discouraged women from applying. The message was polite but firm. The controls weren't meant for them. But history has never listened kindly to those who say can't. And in the 1970s, the walls began to crack. Emily Howell Warner was one of the first to push through. A flight instructor from Colorado, she spent years training male pilots who went on to airlines that refused to hire her. She logged thousands of hours, built a spotless record, and kept applying. Rejection followed rejection, until one day, in 1973, Frontier Airlines finally said yes. When she walked into the cockpit in her uniform, passengers stared, stunned. Some refused to believe it. Others applauded. Emily just smiled, adjusted her headset, and lifted the plane into the sky. She became the first woman airline captain in the United States. Her flight that day wasn't just a journey between cities. It was a quiet revolution cruising at 30,000 feet. Her success opened doors that had been welded shut for generations. But it wasn't easy. Women pilots faced constant scrutiny, whispers about their competence, and the exhausting need to prove themselves again and again. Some airlines limited their routes, claiming customers weren't ready. Others quietly replaced women who became pregnant, as though motherhood and mastery of flight couldn't coexist. Yet, with every flight logged and every safe landing, the evidence grew undeniable. Skill has no gender. In Europe, pioneers like Turi Widerøe in Norway became symbols of progress, taking command of Scandinavian Airlines flights in the 1960s. In the Middle East, women like Lotfia El Nadi, Egypt's first female pilot, and later Hanadi Zakaria Al-Hindi in Saudi Arabia, challenged not only professional norms but cultural ones. Their victories were monumental not because they sought fame, but because they represented permission for other women to dream. As the world moved toward the millennium, commercial cockpits slowly began to diversify. Airlines started hiring women not as exceptions, but as professionals. Female captains began training the next generation, while flight academies reported more women applying each year. Some flew cargo planes through storms. Others piloted international routes across time zones, managing crews, engines, and expectations with the same calm precision as any man. But the climb was still steep. Even in the 21st century, less than 6% of the world's pilots were women. They remained statistical outliers in their own skies, yet that small percentage carried a legacy larger than numbers. Each of them stood on the shoulders of those who had flown before: the daredevils, the racers, the test pilots, the astronauts. Every takeoff was a tribute to those who fought simply for the right to hold the controls. In flight schools and control towers, new faces began to appear. Women taught aerodynamics, designed aircraft systems, and led aviation safety boards. Mechanics, engineers, air traffic controllers. The landscape of aviation slowly began to reflect the diversity of those it served. And in air shows around the world, women soared through barrel rolls and knife-edge turns, painting the sky with smoke trails of defiance and beauty. Beyond the runways, advocacy groups began to rise. Organizations like Women in Aviation International and the 99s, founded by Amelia Earhart and her peers decades earlier, connected pilots across borders. They offered mentorship, scholarships, and community to young women who dreamed of flight. Together, they built something more powerful than an aircraft. They built a movement. By the late 20th century, the cockpit was no longer a forbidden place, but it was still a frontier. The journey of equality in aviation was slower than the jets that carried it, yet unstoppable all the same. Every woman who stepped into a cockpit carried a piece of history with her, from the pioneers who risked ridicule, to the wartime pilots who flew without rank, to the astronauts who crossed the heavens. Flying had changed. The world had changed, but the spirit of those early aviators remained unchanged, fearless, relentless, and free. When Emily Howell Warner retired, she said she never wanted to be remembered as the first woman pilot, only as a good one. That was the victory they had all sought from the beginning. Not fame, not novelty, but equality measured in respect. The sky of the modern world was busier than ever, filled with the sound of engines and the quiet pride of those who had fought to belong there. The women of civil aviation proved that professionalism could be graceful, that authority could be calm, and that courage could wear lipstick, or not at all. They didn't just fly airplanes. They carried history. Every time a young girl looked up at a plane tracing a silver line across the blue, she saw not just a machine, but a promise that somewhere up there, someone who looked like her was at the controls. And in that small, shining moment, the world grew lighter, freer, and closer to the sky. The sound of jet engines once again filled the skies, but this time, it wasn't war that called them, it was progress. Nations were rebuilding, armies were evolving, and the world's air forces were preparing for a new era of precision and power. For decades, combat aviation had been a man's world, guarded by regulations, rank, and tradition. The idea of a woman flying a fighter jet or leading a squadron was dismissed as fantasy. But change, like flight, begins with defiance. The next generation of women aviators didn't just want to fly. They wanted to serve, to command, to defend. And once the door opened, even slightly, they pushed it wide. In the United States, Jeannie Leavitt became the symbol of that breakthrough. When she entered the Air Force Academy, she was told she could fly transports, maybe trainers, but never fighters. Regulations barred women from combat aircraft, yet when the ban was finally lifted in 1993, she became the first female fighter pilot in U.S. history. She flew F-15E Strike Eagles, leading missions that demanded split-second precision and fearless resolve. Her rise through the ranks wasn't easy. She faced skepticism, scrutiny, and silence, but she answered them all with skill. When she later became the first woman to command a combat fighter wing, it wasn't because she was proving a point. It was because she was the best. Her story echoed across the world. In Israel, Roni Zuckerman, granddaughter of Holocaust resistance fighters, became the first female jet pilot in the Israeli Air Force. In the United Kingdom, Jo Salter took to the skies in the Tornado GR1, proving women could fly and fight on equal terms. In Pakistan, Aisha Farouk donned her helmet and climbed into a JF-17 Thunder, defying generations of cultural barriers to become her country's first female combat pilot. These women didn't just fly missions, they redefined what service meant. Their uniforms carried both rank and revolution. In the Soviet Union's successor states, the legacy of the Night Witches found new wings. Pilots like Maria Dolina and later Olga Kulikova carried that heritage into the modern Russian air forces, reminding the world that women's courage in the cockpit had been proven long before the world was ready to admit it. In the Middle East and Asia, female fighter pilots emerged in Turkey, India, and the UAE, each carving her name into a history that had once excluded her entirely. Every flight, every sortie, every training hour became a quiet rebellion turned routine. But the path was never without turbulence. For every woman who earned her wings, dozens were told they didn't belong. They faced locker room whispers, delayed promotions, and headlines that focused on gender before merit. Yet they endured. The aircraft didn't care who was flying it. The G-forces didn't discriminate. And the target didn't ask for credentials. Colonel Kim Campbell became a living testament to that truth. During the Iraq War in 2003, her A-10 Thunderbolt II was hit by heavy fire, losing hydraulics and control surfaces. Her jet was riddled with holes, yet she switched to manual reversion and brought it home. The aircraft limped onto the runway, battered but alive, just like its pilot. Her composure under fire became legendary, a reminder that calm and courage are the true measure of a warrior. In Afghanistan, Captain M. Tamara Zubair from the Afghan Air Force flew supply and rescue missions under constant threat, her service risking not only her life but her family's safety in a country still learning to accept women in uniform. In Ukraine, as new conflicts erupted decades later, women aviators once again took to the skies, echoing the defiance of the Night Witches who had flown those same winds of danger generations before. The faces and flags had changed, but the spirit had not. Modern military aviation demanded not just strength but intelligence, command, coordination, and precision in chaos. Women rose through those ranks as instructors, strategists, and squadron leaders. They trained men, flew combat simulations, managed missile systems, and planned aerial operations. Their success wasn't symbolic anymore, it was operational. They were no longer novelties, they were necessity. In 2012, the U.S. Navy saw its first female squadron commander of the famed Blue Angels demonstration team. In 2017, the Indian Air Force graduated its first class of female fighter pilots. Their flight paths streamed live to inspire millions of young girls across the subcontinent. Nations that had once kept women grounded were now holding parades in their honor. But behind the medals and ceremonies was something quieter, a transformation of identity. These women were not flying to make headlines. They flew because the sky was their duty, their discipline, their calling. They had inherited the courage of those who came before, the early pioneers who risked ridicule, the wartime pilots who flew without recognition, the astronauts who reached beyond the atmosphere. The torch had passed, and they carried it into the stratosphere. Every flight hour logged, every mission completed, every obstacle overcome was a testament to decades of struggle and perseverance. The world's air forces now bore a new kind of hero, one defined not by gender, but by grit. The modern aviator, whether in a bomber or a fighter jet, whether called captain or colonel, carried the same heartbeat that once fluttered in the chests of those who first looked at the sky and saw more than clouds. The women of combat aviation proved that equality in the air is not an act of rebellion, but of belonging. They turned the impossible into protocol, the forbidden into standard procedure. They didn't just fly missions. They carried forward the legacy of every woman who had ever touched the controls and felt the world fall away beneath her. And somewhere in the thunder of afterburners, in the tremor of wings slicing through the wind, the sky itself seemed to whisper what history had finally learned: that courage knows no uniform, and freedom has no face. The Cold War ended, but the battle for equality in the skies did not. Beyond the roar of engines and the discipline of military command, a new horizon was taking shape, one painted in civilian colors. Airlines, once the domain of uniformed men with gold-trimmed caps, began to open their cockpits to women. Yet, even as opportunities grew, prejudice lingered like turbulence on a clear day. The world had celebrated women in space, but still doubted their place at the helm of commercial jets. It would take pioneers, not policies, to change that. One of them was Beverly Bass. She began as a flight attendant because that was the only role airlines allowed women to fill, but she refused to stay in the cabin when her heart belonged in the cockpit. Through persistence and sheer talent, she became the first female captain for American Airlines. Her story reached millions when her calm leadership during the September 11th attacks led to the safe diversion of her flight to Gander, Newfoundland, inspiring the world and immortalizing her courage in the musical Come From Away. Yet even before that day, she had been quietly dismantling stereotypes, one takeoff at a time. Across the ocean, British Airways, Lynn Barton became the first female pilot hired by the company, and later, its first female captain. Her flights were routine, but her presence at the controls was revolutionary. Passengers would sometimes express disbelief or even refuse to fly when they heard a woman's voice over the intercom. She didn't argue. She simply flew better, smoother, more precisely than expected, until skill itself silenced prejudice. In time, she became a mentor to younger women, proving that leadership in aviation was earned in flight hours, not headlines. In Japan, Ari Fuji broke through a wall of quiet resistance, becoming the country's first female airline captain. Her journey was long and marked by isolation, as she trained in a culture where women were rarely seen in command roles. Yet she persisted, not through confrontation, but through mastery. When she took her seat in the left-hand chair of the cockpit, the symbolism went beyond gender. It was a quiet rewriting of national tradition. Commercial aviation wasn't just about breaking records anymore. It was about normalization. The day would come when a child boarding a plane wouldn't find it strange to hear a woman's voice announce their destination. That day began with thousands of unseen women logging flight hours, studying weather systems, managing emergencies, and balancing careers with families in a field that demanded everything. But even as equality took hold in the skies, there was another frontier waiting: space. The air had its limits, but space did not. When Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space in 1963, she set a precedent that lay dormant for years. It wasn't until the 1980s that the door opened again, when Sally Ride became America's first woman astronaut. Her flight aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger was more than a mission. It was a signal to the world that women belonged in every field of exploration, from the deep sea to the infinite void. Eileen Collins carried that signal further, becoming both the first female pilot and the first female commander of a U.S. space shuttle. Her leadership, calm and precise, was a reflection of every woman who had once been told no. She guided spacecraft through orbit, commanded mixed crews, and inspired generations of girls who no longer saw astronauts as unreachable icons, but as possible futures. Her words echoed what so many before her had lived: that barriers break not with loud defiance, but with undeniable excellence. Around the world, nations began to follow. Claudie Higuero from France, Chiaki Mukai from Japan, Anousheh Ansari, the first female private space explorer, and Samantha Cristoforetti, the Italian astronaut, who became known for her brilliance and poise aboard the International Space Station. Each one carried not only her country's flag, but the weight of history, the proof that courage can evolve from cockpit to cosmos. The bond between air and space became a continuum of progress. The same principles that guided early aviators, precision, composure, courage, now guided humanity's steps beyond Earth. Women were no longer guests in these fields. They were pioneers, engineers, and leaders. The shuttle launches and spacewalks were no longer firsts for women. They were missions for humanity. But even in this age of achievement, the echoes of the past remained. Each flight into orbit, each commercial route completed, was a tribute to those who had fought for a chance just to touch a control stick or walk onto a runway. The women of aviation and space were bound by a single thread: the refusal to let gravity define them. From wooden wings to supersonic jets, from the hum of engines to the silence of space, they had carried the dream farther than anyone could have imagined. Their bravery was not a story of rebellion, but of persistence, the kind that turns resistance into routine and dreams into destinations. As the Earth turned beneath their wings and their ships traced arcs of light through the upper atmosphere, one truth became clear: They had not only taken to the skies, they had taken the future with them. The sky had once been a battlefield, a proving ground, and a dream. Now it had become a symbol of something greater: freedom, equality, and progress. The women who flew it were no longer exceptions. They were teachers, innovators, and commanders, shaping the future of flight itself. The legacy that began with fragile wooden planes and open cockpits had evolved into jet engines, spacecraft, and virtual training systems. And at the heart of it all were women whose courage had rewritten the laws of both aviation and society. In classrooms and hangars around the world, a new generation of girls studied the same flight manuals once guarded by men. They learned not just how to fly, but why they could. Flight schools that once refused them now displayed portraits of their alumni. Women with confident smiles, standing beside aircraft that bore their call signs. Mentorship became the new mission. Veterans of the air, from fighter pilots to airline captains, returned to teach the next wave of aviators. They taught not through lectures, but through stories of mistakes, triumphs, and endurance. Stories that proved flight was not inherited, it was earned. In Kenya, Captain Irene Koki Mutungi became the first female pilot for Kenya Airways and the first African woman to captain a Boeing 787 Dreamliner. Her success opened doors across a continent where aviation had long been viewed as a man's world. In India, Gunjan Saxena's service during the Kargil War became the blueprint for courage under fire, leading to more women entering combat and rescue roles. In Saudi Arabia, women who once couldn't drive were now earning pilot licenses, flying regional routes across the Gulf, their wings glinting in the desert sun. Progress had arrived slowly, but it had arrived undeniably. The transformation wasn't limited to the cockpit. Women engineers designed engines, built drones, and programmed flight systems. They worked in control towers and command centers, directing traffic across the skies. Test pilots evaluated aircraft for performance and safety, while astronauts trained for missions to the Moon and Mars. Every flight, every launch, carried traces of their influence. The sky had become a shared domain, no longer marked by exclusion, but collaboration. Yet, the most powerful shift wasn't just technological, it was cultural. Aviation had once measured worth in flight hours and medals. Now it measured legacy and inspiration. When Captain Tammy Jo Schultz safely landed Southwest Flight 1380 after a mid-air engine failure, her calm voice over the radio reminded the world that experience and grace could save lives even at 30,000 feet. When Wally Funk, denied her chance to go to space in the 1960s, finally flew beyond Earth's atmosphere in her 80s aboard Blue Origin's New Shepard, history seemed to circle back to embrace her. The dreams that had been grounded for decades had finally lifted off. Museums and memorials began to tell their stories, not as side notes, but as central chapters of aviation history. Visitors read names once forgotten: Amelia Earhart, Bessie Coleman, the Night Witches, Jacqueline Cochran, Jeannie Leavitt, Eileen Collins. Their faces stared back from photographs, no longer symbols of struggle but of triumph. Children stood beneath suspended aircraft and whispered that they wanted to be pilots too, and for the first time, no one questioned them. The sky was no longer something to be conquered. It was something to be shared. In the digital age, flight simulation and virtual reality brought aviation to anyone with a dream. Young girls practiced takeoffs from their bedrooms, landing safely on virtual runways thousands of miles away. Online communities connected pilots across continents, where women discussed not the impossibility of flight but its details: engine performance, weather patterns, navigation routes. The conversation had shifted from permission to precision. The question was no longer, can women fly? It was, how far will they go next? Governments and aerospace companies began naming programs after the pioneers who had come before. Scholarships bore their names, missions carried their emblems, and the motto of aviation evolved from conquest to inclusion. The International Civil Aviation Organization declared a new vision for the next century of flight, one built on diversity, sustainability, and innovation. Women were not just participants in that vision, they were leaders shaping it. From rural airstrips to orbital stations, from solo flights across oceans to joint missions to Mars, the spirit of the Aviatrix lived on. Their courage had outlasted the wars, the barriers, and the doubt. It had become part of the very air humanity breathed, invisible yet vital, woven into every takeoff, every orbit, every silent moment above the clouds. And as the sun rose over runways across the world, the first rays of light glinted off the wings of aircraft waiting for departure. In each cockpit sat a story, not of rebellion, but of belonging. The legacy of women aviators had reached its horizon, only to find another waiting beyond it. The sky was endless, and so was their journey. The sky has always called to those who dare to rise above limits. From fragile biplanes to roaring jets and silent spacecraft, women have answered that call with unwavering courage. Their stories are not fragments of history, but a continuous flight, one that began with defiance and ascended through generations of determination. Each name carved into the logbooks of aviation is a testament to what belief can do when it refuses to bow to fear. Today, their legacy is not confined to museums or memorials. It lives in every flight school, every mission, every young girl who looks up and sees possibility where others once saw impossibility. The women who took the sky did not just change aviation, they changed the way humanity understands courage. Their flight paths cross time, connecting every heart that has ever longed to soar. And as the engines fade into the horizon and the clouds part to reveal the endless blue, one truth remains. The sky was never the limit. It was the beginning, a promise carried on wings, whispered through history, and kept alive by those who still dare to fly.